Uh, Thank you very much. We will start our program. Excellency, delegates from our member countries who are able to join us for the launching program. Ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to you all and welcome to the Secretariat. We are delighted to have you this afternoon to witness the launching of the framework for action on responsibility to protect this afternoon. Our program this afternoon, we have guest speakers who will be speaking during the launching ceremony. We have first the Australian High Commissioner to Vanuatu, Her Excellency Heidi Bootle. And after her statement, we also have the UN Special Advisor to the Secretary General on a responsibility to protect, who is joining us virtually, who will also deliver the key note and rest for the launching ceremony. And finally, we have the Director General, who will offer words of thanks and also the closing statement to finally conclude our launching program this afternoon. So once again, we thank you for your presence with us this afternoon to be able to launch this very important document on responsibility to protect. Without further ado, I will introduce the first speaker this afternoon. Ms. Heidi Bootle is the Australian High Commissioner to Vanuatu. She is a Caribbean diplomat who has held a number of positions in the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, including senior overseas positions in Louma, Paris, and leadership roles involving Pacific and regional issues. She speaks French, Somalian Pidgin, and holds degrees from the University of Tasmania and the University of the National University of Australia. We are delighted to have her presence this afternoon to deliver statement. Thank you, Excellency.
Thank you very much, MC. Can you hear me? Is that clear? Yeah. MC, DG, and your team at the Melanesian Spearhead Group, distinguished guests. I'm very pleased to be here today at this important event to launch the new framework for the action for responsibility to protect. And I wanted to first up congratulate our long-term partners, the Asia Pacific Centre for Responsibility to Protect and the Global Centre for R2P, also for developing this really valuable framework. So I thank also the Asia Pacific Centre for R2P and the MSG for organising the launch today. A great initiative. And thank you again for the words of welcome. So I wanted to say Australia is committed to upholding the rules-based international order in which sovereignty carries responsibility and the rights of all people are protected. So the responsibility to protect refers to the obligations of states to protect their populations from genocide and other mass atrocity crimes. And R2P was adopted by all states at the World Summit in 2005. It was developed in reaction to events such as horrific genocide that occurred in Rwanda 11 years earlier, and demonstrates the resolve of all states to avoid a repeat of such horrors. So Australia has been a strong advocate for the implementation of R2P since its inception. We promote R2P and atrocity prevention through multilateral fora, as we did during our terms on the UN Security Council and Human Rights Council, and through bilateral diplomatic engagement. And we're also funding a range of partners to advocate for R2P in the UN system, to tackle early warning signs of atrocities and build human rights capacity in our region, and support justice and accountability for mass atrocities. So I'm very pleased that our partner, the Asia Pacific Centre for Responsibility to Protect, is here in Vanuatu to identify how R2P connects to the regional priorities of the Melanesian Spearhead Group and provide guidance on how R2P can be adapted to local contexts in the Pacific. I wanted to acknowledge the important role the Melanesian Spearhead Group plays in facilitating mutual cooperation on sub-regional matters and its contribution to unity, stability and peace building in the region. Pacific nations have a long history of support for R2P and have continually endorsed R2P at the UN General Assembly, and that support has been really important. This year's annual debate on R2P in the General Assembly showed us that many states are looking for ways to move beyond a conceptual discussion of R2P. There's a growing political consensus in what states can actually do domestically and in their foreign policy to better protect populations from mass atrocity crimes. This is exactly what the new R2P framework for action is designed to do. It aims to help states identify what they can specifically do now to reduce the risks of atrocities happening in the future. And I think one of the great merits of the framework is that it's written down for all states. As we know, the world's not divided into states that do face a risk of atrocity crimes and states that do not. All states have underlying strengths and vulnerabilities and can take action now to help reduce future risks. In much of the Pacific, we know that climate change drives significant humanitarian and economic stress. Rising sea levels may reduce supplies of food and increase displacement. These can in turn become key drivers of conflict and heighten the risk of atrocity crimes. And more broadly, in the Pacific, as in many other regions, other issues such as transnational crime, human trafficking and gender-based violence can be further risk factors for atrocity crimes. And to address these issues, it's vital to strengthen human rights protection, accountability, freedom of civil society and gender equality. R2P is, after all, about the responsible exercise of sovereignty and about strengthening state governance and institutions. So at today's launch, I warmly invite you to reflect on how the framework for action can be embedded into your own systems. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to the UN Special Advisor on R2P. Thank you for your earlier comments and echo your calls to take R2P to the people and build a village of R2P. This is the first regional launch of a framework for action on R2P, and I'm very delighted that MSG states as the first recipients of the framework and associated training to acknowledge that. So I'd like to, with that, thank Director General Leonard Louma for graciously supporting the launch of this milestone framework and wish you a very successful event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tomas Vinavalevu. Thank you, through High Commissioner, for your remarks. As the Pacific Director of the Asia Pacific Center for R2P, I'm honored to be with you, High Commissioner, the Special Advisor to the United Nations Secretary General on the R2P, Director General, distinguished representatives of MSG member states, and our partner at the MSG Secretariat to launch the new framework for action on R2P to this region. As I shared in brief today and wish to reiterate this evening, that this is a historical event for our two organizations because it was at the MSG Secretariat that the idea of rolling out the responsibility to protect in our region was initially mooted. So it is apt to say that in many ways, the discussion of R2P is at home in the MSG Secretariat. I pay tribute to Ilan Kiloe and Director General Louma for making our talk story of Talanoa around R2P a reality. The responsibility to protect was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in its World Summit Outcome Document Resolution in 2005, and it aims to protect populations from 4 atrocity crimes: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. And the World Summit Outcome Document Resolution states agreed that R2P holds that 1, every state has the responsibility to protect its populations from mass atrocity crimes. 2, the international community has a responsibility to encourage and assist individual states in meeting that responsibility. And finally, if a state is manifestly failing to protect its population, the international community must be prepared to take action, appropriate collective action. Since 2005, the R2P principle has been endorsed by states in scores of UN resolutions. Despite that support, however, atrocity crimes continue to be committed around the world at a horrifying scale. Collectively, efforts to prevent atrocity crimes being committed and to respond with appropriate measures when such crimes are committed have failed. Moreover, many of the risk factors of atrocity crimes, such as hate speech and identity-based violence, are increasing in many parts of the world. R2P is ultimately about prevention, early warning, and early action. It has close links with the MSG regional security priorities and with issues high on the agenda in Melanesia, including climate change, which can increase the risk of atrocities. As the High Commissioner has indicated, the Australian government has been a strong supporter of the R2P principle since its inception. So too have Pacific countries. At the 2019 United Nations General Assembly plenary meeting on R2P, for example, Fiji made a statement on behalf of the Pacific Islands Forum, linking the concept of R2P with the Biketawa Declaration. The statement asserted that there needs to be no renegotiation on the principle of R2P as endorsed in the terms in the 2005 World Summit Outcome Document Resolution, but rather attention now needs to be turned to collectively implementing R2P. Pacific Islands Forum had agreed that prevention of atrocity crimes needs to be cultivated at all levels so early warning can be translated to early action. The Asia-Pacific Center for the Responsibility to Protect agrees with the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat that collectively we need to direct greater attention to implementing the responsibility to protect. We believe in so far efforts to implement R2P has been hindered by the fact that there is no framework that clearly sets out what states should do to protect populations from atrocity crimes. In other words, there has been no document or tool or manual that comprehensively sets out in an easily accessible way what every state should do domestically and in their foreign policy to reduce the risk of atrocity crimes and to respond to them when they occur. In an effort to fill that gap, for the past year, the Asia Pacific Center and the Global Center for the R2P have been working to develop an R2P framework for action. We launched a framework at the global level earlier this month and are pleased to have the opportunity so soon to share it in the Melanesian context. This is the first opportunity we've had to formally share the framework with a regional organization. The framework aims to produce a readily accessible guide for states regarding what it means to implement R2P. That is to say, what practical action states should take to prevent and respond to atrocity crimes. It provides recommendations across 4 spheres of action. 1, domestic laws, policies, and institutions. 2, bilateral cooperation and influencing. 3, regional cooperation. And 4, international cooperation. The framework is written for all states. not just states that have history of atrocity crimes or that consider themselves to be at high risk of atrocity crimes. This reflects the idea that risk factors of atrocity crimes such as inequality, discrimination, marginalization, xenophobia, and identity-based violence are all present in all societies, albeit to a varying degrees, and that similarly, all states have capabilities, institutions, and actors that serve as inhibitors to atrocity crimes. Regardless of precisely how a state measures up against an atrocity risk analysis, addressing these risk factors and strengthening the inhibitors of atrocity crime will promote less violent and more stable, harmonious, and productive societies. This is precisely the purpose of the framework of action on R2P. It helps guide states, all states, as to how they can build structural resilience and prevention in their own countries and what role they can play in supporting other states to protect their populations. I'm honored to introduce the United Nations Special Advisor to the Secretary General on R2P, Mr. George Okoth-Obbo, to speak more about atrocity prevention and the role of states and regional bodies. Mr. Okoth-Obbo is the UN Secretary General Special Advisor on the R2P, a position he took up 17 months ago, coming from a UNHCR career of nearly 3 decades, working for refugees and internally displaced persons, and before that as a law teacher in his own country in Uganda. Some of you may have learned that Mr. Okoth-Obbo will be concluding his function as Special Advisor in some 2 weeks from today. He has, however, stressed, as he himself probably echo, that his living in the position of Special Advisor will not take away his dedication to and advocacy for R2P or the ideals of the United Nations, which foster peace, harmony, the security, freedom, and social progress of humanity, which he plans to continue championing in his personal capacity now. Distinguished representatives, ladies and gentlemen, may I please invite us to welcome the Special Advisor on R2P, Mr. George Okoth-Obbo, with a warm Melanesian welcome. Thank you, Tomas.
Thank you, Director Romero, Nash Levo. Forgive me if I've butchered already your name, but I really would like first to thank you for those very generous words of introduction, but really particularly to the center as the organizer, together with the MSG Secretariat, of this workshop and this launch event, for having invited me to associate myself with and be part of this signal event. To you, Director General Leonard Louma, thank you too very much, and your Secretariat colleagues, for joining hands with the center to, as I've said, to provide leadership, to provide energy around this event, around the framework that we are going to discuss, and particularly for helping R2P take ground in this region. High Commissioner Bootle, thank you very much already for the remarks you have made. Australia is a big leader in the provenance of R2P from the very inception. Now in this initiative of the framework, but let me already at this point say that in my work over the last 17 months, as Director Romero just mentioned, Australia has stood by my side to the very end when I announced that I would be leaving the function. So it is my delight to make your acquaintance here, as I have made with your other colleagues here in Geneva and in New York. And of course, to the representatives, the member state representatives and organizational representatives of the MSG yourselves. And in that regard, of course, I must recognize in a special way Vanuatu for hosting this event. Thank you for associating me with this event. I have to say that I would like to begin there to really express my delight right off the bat that this launch is taking place, the launch of the framework is taking place in the Melanesian region and in the Pacific. In the 17 months of my function, perhaps the one partner that I have collaborated with the most has been, and continues to this day, 2 weeks before I conclude, to be the Asia Pacific Center on R2P. I have supported this framework initiative from the very beginning. But I must confess that a lot of our collaboration work, even within this territorial cohort of Asia and the Pacific, has tended to concentrate much more on the Asia part of this articulation. So that now we have a dedicated event speaking to the regional and sub-regional focus of the Pacific and Melanesia is, for me, a very, very evocative and very profound event. And I think it provides the element around which I would like to make my first remarks. Because the question has to be, what is there any significance? Is there any importance of that choice? Is there any, what is the message in there, if any, both for the region itself, for the sub-region looking to itself, but also looking outwards to the rest of the world. Already yesterday, this morning, but I would say from the outset, DG Louma posed this very question. In his call for the definition and specification of terms, of concepts, the challenge that he threw was, you would even say, is it even relevant, especially if it is framed as atrocities? So why? What is the significance of this? My dear friends, I would like to say that the dilemma of the scourge of atrocities is that atrocities can live with response. Atrocities can live with accountability. Atrocities can live with transitional justice. Why? Because in all these three cases, and these are very important, and I'm sure they have been and will continue to be discussed in this workshop, in all these cases, they speak to a situation where atrocities either are already occurring and have occurred and people have died. The heart, therefore, of R2P, in the sense in which it realizes the core objectives of protecting people, is in prevention. And in prevention, DG Louma, if you allow me now to speak to the question that you posed to all of us, in prevention, where the 2 feet of R2P lie is not in response, it is in prevention. And when looked at from that way, and even if we do not go back to the histories in this region that have seen atrocities or atrocities-like events that have occurred, if we look at the Melanesian region, if we recall some of what we have already had in the discussion, for instance, of the priorities of the Melanesian region, if we recall some of the particular issues that have been highlighted, for example, around coups, if we recall some of the situations in which governance, in which human rights accountability are at stake, from that point of view, from the point of view of risks, the Melanesian region repeats some of the characteristics of other regions in which atrocities, as we speak today, could be at risk. But in moving forward now, the Melanesian region moves forward more fundamentally in the pathway of prevention rather than in the pathway of response. And from that point of view, the Melanesian region is a textbook case of what R2P was about in realizing the objectives of protecting its people. So this, I would say, is a key reason why R2P is so evocative and poignant for Melanesia itself, but also in pointing outwards to how it could be an example for others. It is because here prevention can be made to work. I would like to mention one other issue which I hope will come up if it has not come up already, and it is really the following. And that is that even today, we still hear, notwithstanding the decisive support around R2P, it is still heard very much that it is a contested subject, that its universality is can be questioned. The Melanesian region brings something to the table which helps in a very demonstrative way to speak to this contention, if indeed it still exists. And that is the role of smaller states. And I mentioned smaller states by size, by population, but particularly by those elements which feed and nourish this so-called contention in the context of R2P. And that is when we speak geostrategic questions, when we speak historical questions, the role that some states have had in, for example, the colonial experience, the power of economy, of political economy, of geomilitary and geostrategic factors. If we look at R2P in the context of this pathology, the smaller states come, the bigger they hit. And we have in the Melanesian region an important collection of states that fit this profile. And the more it would be shown that Fiji, that Vanuatu, that the Solomon Islands, and all the others, that not only is their voice so strong on R2P in the context of the General Assembly, but they are also providing leadership in embedding it, in socializing it on the ground, the more shall the gravitas around R2P be magnified and be shown to be the way in which we will move forward. So I am extremely pleased that the framework has been developed. It was my delight to support and to continue to support this framework project, and that support, that interest will continue as now we are moving with socialization and giving implementation to this framework on the ground. And this is now where I would like to turn and conclude my remarks, and to speak to those elements which are particularly signal in the language of socialization, of implementation, of operationalization. And you will hear me, quite frankly, echo many of the things that have already been said since this workshop started. In this regard, the very first thing that I would like to start with and to applaud the framework for is what many have said about the need to demystify, to unpack, and to download R2P. What the framework does is to step down from this argument of what is R2P, is it legally defined, what is its normative character, and so forth, and to break it down in these 4 chapters that Director Romulo just elaborated well. And it says to all of us, and it says particularly to the member states, such as in the MCG context, who are already leaning forward and wish to move ahead with implementation. It says to them, this is what it is. To the question of what does it mean to institutionalize it, this is what it means. To the question of what are the instruments that we could use, the framework says this is it. When a country will say, but look, what can we do with our bilateral partners? This is what the framework does. So this demystification, this unpacking is one of the greatest values that the framework does. And from that point of view, it is a big sister to the framework of analysis that has already been referenced in the workshop, and I believe more of it will be discussed, because the framework brings us to the point of illuminating risk, the framework of analysis. The framework of action now says this is what you can do about it. And one of the things that is so crucial about this is that the framework of action is set in the bandwidth of Pillar 1 to Pillar 2. It indeed does not exclude, and Pillar 3 should not be excluded. But the thick pyramid in which the framework is set is in fact the very pyramid in which R2P itself is set, which is between 1 and 2, and not necessarily only 3, particularly the sharp end of 3, which at the global level has tended to dominate the discourse around R2P. So hooray to the framework, but this is probably one of its greatest values that is as provided to us. Secondly, political ownership and political leadership. This, I echo everything that has been said on the importance of this point. Would just like to add that as a start for every country that is considering or has appointed a focal point on R2P, please go ahead and do so and empower that function to do all the roles around R2P that are foreseen for it. But that is just the start, because for R2P not only to be socialized, but to be embedded, as High Commissioner just said earlier on, there are two important maneuvers that are so critical. The first is that it absolutely must start in leadership, in political and governance leadership of the country. And secondly, it has to be horizontalized across the whole of government. So there we see what the role of the R2P is. It is not the end of the socialization pathway, it is just the start of it. And political will drives it. Without political ownership, without political recognition, and without political leadership, at the very top, I would really underscore, we would not see the mobility and the movement that we would like to see in the Melanesian region and, of course, the world at large. In that context, localization is key. Localization is key. I want to make very, very clear that I have every support for R2P in its bespoke R2P branded manner in which it was adopted in 2005. I call this the output approach to R2P. In other words, in the very same way in which it was adopted, complete plus the language of R2P, plus the focus on the atrocities, which Nikki outlined yesterday already at the beginning. I have every support for this. But there is no question that once it gets to the ground, both the challenges, but particularly the enablers, particularly the multipliers, are crucial. And that speaks to the fact that when it gets on the ground, R2P would not be able to take root and flourish without an important element of localization, particularly to recognize the particular factors. And here, DG Louma has a big point, that the issue of language is key. When I undertook a mission to Jakarta with, again, the Asia Pacific Center at the beginning of this year, I found that in many of my contacts, in many of my conversations, as long as I was speaking this output language, this bespoke language of R2P and so on, in many cases, frankly, I was just speaking to myself. But as I understood much more and started to embrace and to recognize and to understand the particular pathologies of the region, the importance of consensus, and that consensus is not a cancel out in all cases, but provides a space in which positive outcomes could be realized, then we could see the grounds in which we could move forward. So this localization is key, and there again, I would like to applaud the framework for having provided really a toolbox in which I am sure every government, every player can look into it and find elements which work for it and which can be developed further. I turn now to the role of civil society, and since this has been underlined already so strongly, including even now in this event, I would just like to come back to one issue, and that is the following. I believe it was Nikki who mentioned the sight of people themselves in Myanmar, but it is not only there. In Myanmar, they specifically used the language of R2P. They called for it. In others, including my country and the region which I come from, in which there are actual examples of R2P having saved the day and where language that is specific to R2P would not have been used, in real terms, this is what we have had people call for. At DG Louma, I would say this is the ultimate answer to the question you posed at the beginning of this workshop. And that is this, that the people themselves say it. The people themselves who are exposed to the risk call for it. And finally, that it is above all this component of civil society, not the only, but this particular component of civil society that has to be given space in the dynamic of R2P, its socialization and uptake, and not only to be heard, but for them to have agency with R2P. And the moment these two things happen, i.e. that they are heard, they are listened to and given agency, there is an absolute answer to the question of the relevance of R2P. Because this, what I have referred to in other conversations, or as the village of R2P, is inescapable and it is inevitable and is the ultimate answer to the question of implementation. Let me add two things together so as to complete as quickly as possible, and that is the regional dimension and the global dimension. In the 17 months I have been in this function, it has struck me more and more that the place, the role, and the importance of the regional dimension is really not fully recognized. The first one being that if indeed Pillar 2 is going to be an important door for the way in which R2P is socialized, the bridge between the global, which again, as you have seen, the framework has highlighted in terms of what the global can and must do, the bridge between the global and the national, which is the focus of the framework, more than half the framework is about the national, the regional role is so key in there. And that role is particularly important on this localization issue. And let me give you just one example from the region that I come from and perhaps know a little better than others. And this is the African Union. The African Union is the regional, so far today, the only regional setting in which R2P is actually articulated normatively in legal terms through the Charter of the African Union. It is true that there it is 3 and not 4 of the atrocity crimes, but never mind, those 3 are articulated as one, in fact, of the 4 cornerstones of the entire African Union framework. But if you go to the African Union website right now and say, well, here is a region that has mandated R2P in legal terms, and expect, therefore, you would find R2P in that language, you won't find it. So, but what is going on? What is happening here? Until you start to look at the language, the mechanisms, the frameworks of that system, and you start to look at its regional peace and security commission, you start to look at what it is doing with mediation, you start looking at what it is looking with conflict prevention, and there you see it. So this is the equivalent. If those security priorities for the Melanesian region that we have heard about are going to be so important for the uptake of R2P, the implication of that is that the regional dimension has to be made much, much stronger. And quite frankly, even for Pillar 3, And I repeat, I am a believer that every part of Pillar 3, including the sharp end of Pillar 3, is important. But it is so clear, and particularly after what happened in Libya, that that part of Pillar 3, for the very importance for which it would foreseen, I do not think we will ever expect to see any situation in which it would be played out without the regional dimension being given the importance that it deserves. And here again, we see it in the success stories that have been cited, for example, in Africa, that is relevant to R2P, whether that was in Cote d'Ivoire, in Somalia, in Darfur, where international missions were stood up to help protect people, that those missions were possible only as a handshake between the global and the regional. So the regional dimension is absolutely important. I finish now with the global dimension. I had a number of things to say in here, but in the interest of time, let me just pick one. And that is the collaboration, the partnership, and the complementarity, which can continue to be counted on, not only by the UN at large, but particularly the office of which I am part. And no matter that I myself as George will not be part of it in 2 weeks' time, I am sure there will be another special advisor who will be appointed. And that office is in fact present. Please, it is your go-to place. It is the place in which partnership has been and should continue to be exercised in a very, very meaningful way across all the things that the framework highlights, particularly in its fourth and final chapter. But as you see in the framework, it correlates a lot of those things to the first platform of the framework, which is the national dimension. So this partnership collaboration is very important. Still at the global level, I would like really to make a strong urge, a strong appeal to the MSG membership who have already by their voice signaled a very forward leaning on R2P to continue to multiply and to optimize their participation, their role at the global level. Many of you, I accept, are smaller missions. You have your officers who are covering several things at the same time, but particularly in the General Assembly context, in the group of member states context, in the Human Rights Council, and in what I call related agendas. There is no time to go into them, but particularly agendas such as the CAC agenda, such as the SDGs. There is a summit on the SDGs which is going to take place in September, as you all know. In WPS, in YPS, in all these dimensions, R2P is important and relevant. Please up your and maximize your voice, your participation in this, with a particular emphasis on sharpening the R2P lanes, the R2P specificities, and the R2P outcomes, as I mentioned. In conclusion, for the state and organizational members of MSG, not only is R2P the moment of imperative for you internally, but the example that you will orchestrate, that you will engineer, will be important externally. I appeal to you to please start that or continue that journey with the framework, with the partnership, with the membership, with the facilitation that the MSG and the Global Center, the Asia Pacific and its global chapter are providing on that initiative. To MSG and the center itself, now is also the moment of truth. We should not allow this framework to sit on a shelf somewhere and start to gather dust. It must take life. And that means the question of follow-up becomes key. I know that both of you will continue to please be the pen holder. It is now as important as it was ever before. Please continue, and as a free citizen of the world, in my private capacity, I reiterate that I shall continue in every way that will be possible to be part of this effort and part of this journey with you. For your global partners whose diplomatic representatives are here, again, thank you for supporting the framework, but that framework is for you as well. So on this, I want to conclude with two things. And that is, number one, particularly for this follow-up agenda that I have called for and urged, please continue to support that as well. But secondly, I am in the group that actually supports very strongly R2P as an important foreign relations, external relations provenance. Very importantly, there is criticism that no, R2P is too much as an external relations issue, objective. No, I do not believe that there is too much R2P in external relations. The contrary is the case. There is too little and often none in ways that can cause harm, in ways where development cooperation, cooperation even around rule of law, even around democracy, can continue. There you have external relations, foreign relations, even when atrocity crimes are already evident. So the appeal that I have here is not to lower, but rather to enhance, to escalate the place of R2P in global development, in global diplomatic, in global geostrategic partnership. And if I had my way, it would to even make it a conditional imperative in those relations. And the second appeal that I have, however, is not only should R2 be seen as an external dimension priority, it must have a domestic face as well. That those two things are seen and evident together, not only because no place is ultimately safe from the risks and the potential occurrence of atrocities, it also helps us remove this what about argument. What about X or Y or Z? Why are you present? Where is the consistency? What about the double standards and so on? It helps us that everywhere, for every nation, for every state, which is what the framework says, we have both these two sides working together. For the UN, I echo what I have said already, that complementarity, that partnership is there, will be found. Please up your play within that space and also reach out to it. And finally, for myself personally, I am leaving the function of Special Advisor to the Secretary General, which it has been my honor to serve. But I am an R2 peer for life. Once an R2 peer, always an R2 peer. I shall continue and hope very much that in that context, our paths shall cross. I look forward very much to that moment for us continuing to do what in East Africa we call the Harambe, that is moving together forward. And I thank you very much for listening to me. God bless you all.
Thank you very much, Special Advisor to the Secretary General, and the responsibility to protect for that comprehensive and very important speech that you've delivered. It is truly appreciated. We'll now move on, and I invite the Director General to offer his statement and also word of thanks to conclude our program this afternoon. Thank you, Director General. Heidi Bootle, the United Nations Special Advisor on Responsibility to Protect, Mr. George Okoth-Obbo, delegates from the MSG countries, representatives of the Asia Pacific Center for Responsibility to Protect, I think those who are knowledgeable on the subject have spoken, and I share the sentiments expressed by them. I am pleased and honored to deliver this closing statement on behalf of the Secretariat on this auspicious occasion of the launching ceremony of the Responsibility to Protect Framework for Action. I'm also pleased to note that this launching of the R2P framework here at the MSG Secretariat is the first for the Asia Pacific region. The MSG Secretariat is proud and honored to co-host this event. I wish to therefore express my deep appreciation to the Asia Pacific Center for Responsibility to Protect for agreeing to have the MSG Secretariat partner it to launch this important framework document here today. I firmly believe that the R2P framework will provide practical tools to assist our governments contribute to monitoring, risk assessment, and identify early warning on atrocities. However, I am not naive not to be aware that cynics would attempt to diminish the significance of actions contemplated or that will be undertaken within the R2P framework as being over the top. And while I admit that our part of the world has not yet experienced the levels of atrocities as that experienced elsewhere, as I mentioned this morning, we would do well to keep a close watch on trends developing and seek to address enablers of potential atrocities now. As affirmed by the Special Advisor, Okoth-Obbo, it would pay to abide by the old saying, prevention is better than cure. The R2P framework serves that purpose. It has utility in our region. I wish to express our appreciation to the Australian High Commissioner to Vanuatu, Her Excellency Heidi Bootle, for accepting our invitation to deliver the opening statement during this launching ceremony. And also for the positive disposition that Her Excellency always showed towards having Australia consider supporting the activities of MSG. We in MSG are fortunate and thankful that Australia continues to maintain robust bilateral programs in our member countries in many sectors, but especially in inculcating the respect for rule of law and in good governance and law and other sectors. We look forward to exploring joint efforts with Australia in the area of R2P. I would like to thank the UN Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General on R2P, who, I'm advised, is a strong supporter of practical implementation of R2P, and your passionate statement this afternoon underscores that. Distinguished delegates, the launching of the R2P framework for action here at the MSG Secretariat is historical. It is a milestone achievement that, and for selfish reasons, might I say, will elevate the profile of the MSG Secretariat. I have no doubt that the R2P framework for action will provide our government officials as well as MSG Secretariat insights into state commitments that aim to protect populations from atrocities, war crimes, and crimes against humanity in Melanesia. As I mentioned this morning, there are already certain insidious actions taking place in our countries that, if not arrested now, will easily have us on the proverbial slippery slope towards serious cases of atrocities. The potential mass displacement of populations in the MSG region as a result of climate change and sea level rise is an important subject matter that I want the MSG to focus on this year and beyond. Finding meaningful solutions to address the impacts of climate change on the livelihood of our people is a priority which I intend to exert a lot of influence on while head of the MSG Secretariat. The reason for this is simple, and it was articulated very well by High Commissioner Bootle, that climate change can be a driver to actions that could be classed as atrocities. I want to ensure that the MSG security strategy clearly identify actions and action plans that aims to address impacts of climate change and ways where we can be able to effectively mitigate them. The MSG Secretariat looks forward to strengthen our collaboration with the Center for R2P in advancing the key commitments identified under the R2P framework, and to continue to provide necessary assistance and training to our members on how to address challenges that threatens the lives of our people in Melanesia. Speakers this afternoon have made this call, and I want to join them in saying that there is need to follow up with actions. We must walk the talk. I am confident that with the assistance of our expert and learned facilitators, our members and the MSG Secretariat can be able to develop appropriate recommendations on the implementation of the commitments contained in the R2P framework for action. In closing, I wish to reiterate my deep appreciation to the Center for R2P and all of you for joining us to witness the launching of the R2P framework for action this afternoon. Thank you, Merci beaucoup. Thank you to Ms. Oleti. Thank you, Director General, for that closing statement, and also words of thanks. to all the speakers and participants this afternoon. This brings us to the end of the launching ceremony. But I'm getting so far the Director General of the MSG Secretariat, and on behalf of the Asia Pacific Center for our responsibility to protect as hosts of the launching ceremony this afternoon, we would like to extend our sincere appreciation to all of you, in particular, Excellency, the Australian High Commissioner to the Republic of Vanuatu and your staff, and also members of our delegation from MSG countries for joining us this afternoon for the launching ceremony. Thank you very much, and a very good afternoon to you all.